Today, we're diving into the story of a perfect failure. Seriously, it's one of the most infamous fiascos of the entire Cold War. Okay, picture this. It's April 1961. In the dead of night, about 1,500 Cuban exiles are storming a remote beach. Now, these aren't just random guys. They've been trained, armed, and, funded by the CIA. Their mission? Sounds simple, but it was incredibly audacious. Overthrow Fidel Castro. The whole thing was supposed to be a secret, a surgical strike, a quick and easy win for the US. Instead, well, it became a public, spectacular failure. The entire invasion just collapsed in less than 72 hours. So the big question is, right? How does a plan backed by the world's most powerful intelligence agency, fall apart so completely and so fast? Well, to really get why this thing was such a disaster, we've got to rewind a bit. We need to look at the revolution that set the whole stage for this conflict, happening right on America's doorstep. You know, this quote from a former U.S. ambassador really just says it all. For decades, Cuba was basically an American economic colony. U.S. businesses controlled pretty much everything: sugar, utilities, you name it. And this was the world that Fidel Castro was absolutely determined to shatter. And his path to power was, wow, it was fast. In 1956, he's launching this guerrilla war from the mountains against the U.S.-backed dictator, a guy named Batista. Just 2 years later, by the end of '58, Batista is gone. He's fled the country. And then only a few weeks later, Fidel Castro is sworn in as prime minister, promising this brand new, independent Cuba. And he wasn't wasting any time. That new era, it began immediately. Castro's government started these huge land reforms, and then they began nationalizing private property. We're talking about over $1.5 billion in assets owned by American companies. He was just taking apart the old system, piece by piece. And look, this was not some subtle, under-the-radar shift. The headlines on Cuban newspapers were screaming it in October 1960. Forced expropriation of industries. You can imagine how that went over in Washington. To the United States, this wasn't just about business. No. This was a direct ideological punch, happening just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So, of course, the U.S. hit back, and they hit back hard. They slapped a crippling economic embargo on Cuba, going right for the jugular, its sugar industry. But this economic warfare, it basically pushed Castro right into the arms of America's biggest rival, the Soviet Union. All right, so with Cuba now cozying up to the Soviets, the Eisenhower administration makes this fateful decision. They decide Castro has to go, period. And guess who gets the job of figuring out how to do it? Yep, the CIA is tasked with drawing up a top-secret plan. The plan's original codename was Operation Pluto. So in March of 1960, President Eisenhower gives the CIA the green light. He also gives them a pretty hefty starting budget of $13 million. The mission? Organize, train, and arm Cuban exiles to go in and topple Castro. So who were the guys on the ground? The fighting force at the heart of all this was called Brigade 25006. It was a group of about 1,500 Cuban exiles, men who had fled Castro's Cuba. The CIA scooped them up, took them to these secret camps in Guatemala, and basically trained them for war. Amphibious landings, guerrilla tactics, the whole shebang. But right before the plan could get off the ground, there's a big change in Washington. A young John F. Kennedy wins the 1960 election. And suddenly, the secret, incredibly high-stakes operation gets passed from one president to the next. It was a real hot potato, and now it was sitting in JFK's hands. So Kennedy gets this plan, but he's nervous. He's really wary. His number one concern was something called plausible deniability, basically making sure no one could definitively prove the White House was behind this. The original landing spot, Trinidad, he thought was way too high profile, so a critical, last-minute change was made. The new target? A remote, swampy, and what would turn out to be a tactically awful location, the Bay of Pigs. And that one change brings us to the invasion itself. And let me tell you, this was a textbook example of how a military operation can go wrong at literally every single step. So you've got 1,500 men. That's the total size of the invasion force. And these guys were fiercely motivated, no doubt about it. But their entire plan, everything they were banking on, hinged on one critical assumption, that as soon as they landed, the Cuban people would rise up and join them. And that, well, that was a fatal miscalculation. Because this is what they were actually up against. The second they landed, Castro mobilized his army and local militias. We're talking a combined force of over 200,000. So the invaders were outnumbered more than 100 to 1. The odds weren't just bad, they were impossible. The whole thing fell apart so fast. First, the preliminary airstrikes. They failed to destroy Castro's small air force. So when the main force landed on the beach, they were immediately getting hit from the air and on the ground. But then came the final fatal blow. President Kennedy, desperate to keep the U.S. role a secret, made the decision to cancel the American air support the brigade was promised and counting on. They were stranded on that beach, totally exposed. Their fight was over in less than 3 days. And the human cost for the invaders was just devastating. More than 100 were killed in the fighting. The rest, about 1,200 of them, were captured. They were even paraded on Cuban television. For the exiles who had risked everything, and for the United States, it was an absolute, total, humiliating defeat. But the failure at the Bay of Pigs was so much more than just a botched invasion. It sent massive shockwaves through the entire Cold War. And honestly, you can still feel some of the consequences today. I mean, listen to this quote from the Undersecretary of State at the time. He said the failure shattered the myth of a new frontier run by a new breed of incisive, fault-free supermen. It was a huge psychological blow to the Kennedy administration. This young, confident new frontier had just fallen flat on its face on the world stage. A truly profound and public humiliation for the U.S.
And here's the biggest irony of the whole thing. The operation that was designed to get rid of Castro, it ended up making him stronger than ever before. He had stood up to and defeated an invasion backed by the United States. It totally cemented his image as this great nationalist hero, defending Cuba from the big, bad American government.
So the failed invasion didn't just embarrass the U.S., it terrified Cuba. Castro was absolutely convinced another attack was coming, and it was probably going to be bigger. So he ran straight into the arms of the only country powerful enough to protect him, the Soviet Union. He officially declared Cuba a socialist state, and that cemented an alliance that would completely change the game in the Cold War. And that new alliance, well, it led directly to one of the most terrifying moments in human history. To protect their new friend, the Soviets started secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, missiles that could hit almost any city in the United States. When the U.S. discovered those missiles, it triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought the world to the absolute brink of nuclear war. And you can draw a straight line from that crisis right back to the disastrous decisions made at the Bay of Pigs. So yeah, the Bay of Pigs was a perfect failure. It backfired in pretty much every way imaginable for the United States. But it does leave us with one final really interesting question to think about. What if it had worked? What would our world look like today if that desperate gamble on a remote Cuban beach had actually succeeded?